Welcome. If you're visiting, I'm Brent, one of the crew here, and we're going to be preaching out of the book of Hebrews. So maybe just a little bit of history as we come to it. So we don't know who wrote the book. Many of the Old Testament books never had titles on them. It was given the name, the book of the Hebrews, because it really is a book written to Jewish believers. And one of the beautiful things about the book of Hebrews is that it ties together the Old and the New Testaments. Quite often I've found that people read the New Testament and they find a God of love and mercy and compassion, and then they go to the Old Testament and they find often a God who can be, it's definitely there, wrathful and vengeful and jealous and angry God, we're told at points, and often they can miss how the two link together. And so people often say, well, the God of the Old Testament seems so different to the God of the New Testament. And what the book of Hebrews does is it ties those two halves of the scriptures together to understand the fullness and the beauty of God. And so we're going to be reading a section that's often called the Hall of Fame of Faith. And so Marley's going to be reading for us. Let's listen to God's word. I will read some of it later on at the end of the sermon. This is the first half of Hebrews chapter 11. Listen to the word of the Lord.
Hebrews 11, verse 1 to 16. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, and that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him in the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had not been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
Thanks, Marley. So I don't know if you remember school maths. Do you remember Pythagoras' theorem at all, everybody? The square and the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. Does anybody still remember how to prove Pythagoras' theorem? Neither can I. But there was a way that you could prove it for all triangles. There was evidence for these things. Many of us work in fields where there is a bunch of evidence is required for certain things. If you're in the medical field, we want to know that medication or some prosthetic device or some procedure actually works. And so a doctor may experiment a little bit, but we want to question, we want to find evidence for these things to know that they're true. We don't just want to listen to the hype of some marketing salesman who works for a big pharma. We want evidence that these things are actually effective and can shift and change a bunch of things. Now, for many people, evidence is the final and immutable truth for all things. I've got a friend of mine who tells me that unless he can hear it, see it, touch it, taste it, or smell it, he will not believe in it. There's got to be evidence for things, and that is his final rule of faith and life. And he's a bit of a fiery character, so I haven't poked him too hard yet, but I want to say to him at points, it's really interesting because that statement itself cannot be proved by any evidence. It's a great thing to believe, and I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm an engineer by training. I love evidence, but there's no evidence that statement itself, that evidence-based reasoning is the best way to find truth. There's no evidence that statement is itself truth. In fact, the reality is that for many of the things in life that are truly important to us, we find ourselves standing on foundations of faith. Whether we like it or not, that's part of being human. In love, we want evidence. You meet this person, you decide they're pretty attractive to you, you like something about their body, you love something about their intellectual capacity, some of the way they laugh, there's some attraction, there's a spark, you begin to connect, and then you ask all sorts of questions. Where were you born? What's your family like? What other relationships have you had? You want to know some of their history. You go for premarital counseling when you decide you want to get married, and hopefully I, as a minister, I'm helping you ask a whole bunch of questions, because you want to go in with as much evidence as you can have that when that person makes their vows, they're actually intending to really honor them and to love you and to cherish you until God shall separate you by death. But when you stand there and make those vows, it is a leap of faith. You have no idea whether those things are in fact true. You've done as much homework as you can, but at some level you have to take a leap of faith. And then when you make those crazy vows, you have no idea of the implication of those vows. Last week we buried Rudy Fruin, one of our older members. He has been looking after his wife who has dementia for many years now, and it was just so sad and tender to say goodbye to him after he has served and loved her so well. And he said to me at one point before his death, I'm just hanging around to look after her. That was the only reason he was staying. In the Lord's wisdom, the Lord took him first. He had no idea when he was 20-odd years old when they got married that he was saying that when he said, I will love you and honor you and cherish you in richer, for poorer, sickness, and in health. He didn't understand the implications of those things. By faith, he had to believe that he had the ability to do what God was going to ask him to do. And so we live in a world that's looking for a lot of evidence for a lot of things, and it's one of the reasons many people struggle with religion, because they do want some answers to some of the big existential questions that they have. And one of the reasons that many people struggle to come to faith in Jesus is because often Jesus' people aren't that good at giving reasons for the hope that lives within us, which is exactly what Peter tells us to do. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. So you have a friend and they say to you, well, why should I believe that Jesus is especially unique? Why can I not believe in any of the other religions or any of the other religious teachers? Because after all religions teach the same thing, is what they would say. And you as a Christian should be able to go, that no, I can give you evidence that is not true. If you look at Jesus and you look at Muhammad, they taught vastly different things. One was kind, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, honored women and children, and was not a murderer, and a whole bunch of other things. And then on the other hand, you have Muhammad, who demonstrably is in a vastly different place. Please do not allow your friends to tell you that it doesn't really make a difference what you believe, because they all teach the same thing. And so people are asking deep questions about what do we do with religion? And you're making some claims about Jesus. So you're telling me that he rose from the dead? Like every person I've seen that's been dead has stayed dead. How do you expect me to believe in a resurrection? And we should talk about some of the evidence contained in both the Bible and in books outside of the Bible about the reasons for the resurrection. We should be able to talk about the fact that there were these 12 guys who followed Jesus, whose lives were confusing, and they were often themselves confused. And then, post the resurrection, we find them boldly proclaiming in all sorts of places, going to the ends of the earth to proclaim the wonder of this Jesus who had saved them. There are a lot of reasons why we believe in the resurrection of the dead. But the reality is that as you get through the scriptures, you will also find that there is no watertight evidence for believing in Jesus. At some level, we have to lean in to faith. There are books that you should read. Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell was one that I read when I was a young teenager. I haven't read it in many, many years. I have no idea how readable it is these days, but it was a really helpful book for me. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and then countless YouTube videos. William Lane Craig, John Lennox, Sean McDowell, Mike Licona, Cliff Knechtel. There are a whole bunch of these guys. Incredible apologists for the Christian faith who will help you make good arguments to your friends about why there are rational reasons for us to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. But what the Bible will not give you is a Pythagoras theorem that can prove beyond all reasonable doubt. It will give you a foundation on which to build things. There is evidence and good truths and good reasons why we believe in the resurrection from the dead. But at some point, like a skydiver in that airplane, you've done all the groundwork, you've learned how the parachute works, and at some point the instructor kicks you out the door, and at that point you start praying, because now it's faith. I'm going to leap out the door and trust that the parachute will catch me. So the evidence is compelling, but it's not irrefutable, and we are required to live by faith. Even when Jesus was on the earth, people came to him demanding miracles because they wanted evidence to show that the claims that he was making were true. If you're claiming to be this religious leader and to have power over the created order, and in fact, when you are claiming to be God, well, fine, then do this thing and prove it to us. And Jesus is, no. In fact, in Mark's gospel, they asked him for a sign from heaven. I love this. He sighed deeply. No. I tell you, no sign will be given, says Jesus. We want evidence. Jesus says, well, you're going to have faith. It seems to be the framework in which God wants us to work. I'm going to give you foundations, he's saying. There is good evidence to believe these things. There is history. There's this incredible book, the Bible, that we read from. There is no other book like it. There just really is not, and certainly not in this day and age. And those things are all part of the foundation, and we can look at the lives of the early church, especially those first followers of Jesus. Those things you can use as building blocks to shape a foundation, but at some point what you're going to build onto that is going to be faith. It's the framework for receiving Christ, being born of the Spirit. It's not evidence, it's faith built on a foundation of evidence. It's being confident in the things that we hope for in Jesus, a room in our Father's house, treasures in heaven, a royal place at the banquet, a country that is not like this country, and a holy city that is not like this city. And these things are built on the evidence, but at some point you're going to have to respond with faith. Faith is living life differently because you have staked your future on the one to whom the evidence points. And all of these Old Testament people, verse 13, were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive those things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on earth. And so this particular passage is just outlining all of these people who saw something of what God would be doing, who had received some promises that God would eventually bring this chosen one, the Messiah, but they saw dimly, they just saw outlines and hazy images, but they trusted God, they acted in faith, and that is what then gets counted towards them as righteousness. So often I get asked though about these Old Testament characters. So like they didn't know who Jesus was. In case you didn't know this, by the way, they didn't know who Jesus was. There were glimpses of him through the Old Testament prophets, but it was a pretty hazy image. So how then do they get saved? And in fact, I was on the youth camp 2 weekends ago that Tyler ran, just an incredible camp with a bunch of really bright young people who were asking all sorts of questions. It was exactly one of the questions I was asked. And here's my best illustration that I heard many years ago. Imagine a Roman legion of soldiers marching from one city to the next. It's a couple of days' journey. They have to have some food on the way, and they are tolls. There was a toll road, through the tunnel. There were toll roads in those days. They arrive at a bridge. In the middle of this battalion is a guy who carries the chest with the money in it, with which they're going to buy food and pay tolls. The first part of that battalion arrives at the bridge. Somebody at the front says, there is a toll to be paid. They say the guy's coming with the money, and they begin to walk across the bridge. And eventually, when this first half of the battalion is across the bridge, they look to the one who is to come, who will pay their toll for them. The rest of the battalion, this is us, we arrive at the bridge, and we look at somebody who has already paid for us. Does that kind of make sense? Now, obviously, this side of the cross, we've got a lot more clarity about who Jesus is, because we've got the New Testament to go to. We can see what he did. We can see the reality of what he taught. We can see him going to the cross, dying, being raised again. They had glimpses, like Psalm 22, that tells us that his bones will not be broken and that they will cast lots for his clothing. There were the prophecies in Isaiah of one who would come, by whose stripes we will be healed. So we get to see this really clear picture of Jesus who's gone ahead of us and paid for us. These people in this particular passage are looking into the future, believing and trusting that God would do something. And so these Old Testament faithful worshipers like Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were waiting for God to do something, even if they weren't really sure exactly what it was about. But they trusted. There was enough there that they could trust God. And I wonder if there's a lesson for us in these things, because whilst we can see Jesus really clearly, often in our day-to-day lives, in our decision-making around jobs and careers and family and marriage and all of those kinds of things, all of our big life decisions, it's not always that clear how things are going to pan out. Like we all do this, right? You all pray? You all pray about big things? Like you got a big decision to make. Do I choose this job or this job? Do I marry this person or this person? We all pray about those things. And God's really clear in his answers, right? Not always, if we're honest. And so we're trying to wrestle these things out without clarity. And that's what God wants us to do. He wants us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. He wants to be involved in this decision-making process. And whilst we're looking for really clear evidence on a whole bunch of things, it seems that the framework is, no, you have to trust me in these things. I'm going to give you enough to go on. I'm going to give you enough information to make the next step. But I'm not going to give you the whole end game. I need you to walk by faith. That seems to be the rhythm of the scriptures. Like, how on earth is Abraham going to have children as numerous as the stars? Because when Abraham receives this promise, I mean, that's a great promise to have. You're going to have children as numerous as the stars in the night sky, as numerous as the grain. And then you look at your wife and you're like, yes, bro, you are so far beyond your best by date. Like, I don't know how this thing's going to work. Like, I can't see how, like, we're old. Like, things don't work like they should or used to. I don't know how you're going to do this, but I'm going to trust you, God, even if I'm uncertain about the how you're going to get this right. Can you imagine Noah building that ark in the desert? He is not trained as a shipbuilder. There is no massive body of water. He has never seen the ocean. He has probably never been in a boat. And here he is building this ark going, I don't know where the water's coming from. I don't know how you're going to get the animals into it. I have no idea at all, but I'm going to trust you, Lord, because you've given me enough to go on. I have some plans, some dimensions. You told me what wood to use and how to make this thing waterproof. I don't know whether it's going to work, but I'm going to trust you because you're asking me to act and to live and to move in obedience, trusting in things that I cannot see and certain promises that I've heard but I haven't seen the results of yet. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And when you see something from a distance, you don't see clearly. You can see the big picture kind of, but there's lots of detail that you don't have. I saw a picture that a friend of mine posted this week. I haven't seen them for quite some time. And in the photograph, I was like, oh, I can see his wife. I don't know what it was. Have you ever seen a photograph of somebody like that? It was just the way she stood. But then I also noticed she was standing with her arm in a certain way. And I was like, oh, you pregnant. And I ran into her yesterday, and she's got this lovely little baby book. But I was very careful. You never say anything unless you can actually see the baby coming out. You never ask anybody. And then somebody else asked her. I was like, shoo, she is pregnant. Good. I would have been okay. But there's detail that they want that they can't quite see. But there's a nuanced picture as they look at their lives, as they read the Old Testament scriptures. The Old Testament is filled with the promises of a Savior who would be raised up, one who would be greater than King David, whose kingdom would know no end. There would be the greater Jonah, who would not be in the belly of a fish, but in the belly of the earth for 3 days. A greater Isaac, who would be sacrificed and offered to God. And all of Scripture and all of their history is pointing towards this Messiah, these brush strokes that are painting a picture. And they trusted that God would do something in the future, and that faith is counted towards them as righteousness. In fact, one of the beautiful things about the Old Testament scriptures, and particularly Hebrews' interpretation of these things, is that these people who were looking forward to God doing something, their lives themselves were shadows of what God would ultimately do. Their very characters embodied glimpses of Jesus and pointed towards Jesus. And they saw this dimly and trusted that God in time would do something. And I think there is such a deep lesson for us because we need to have faith that is confidence in what we hope for and assurance of the things that we do not see. And whilst I hope that your Christian faith is built on some good reasons, I hope there's some good rationality to why you believe in the resurrection, not just that I was born in a Christian home and therefore I'm going to believe in Jesus, but if I'd been born in a different home, I wouldn't. No, that might be the reason that you learned about Jesus, but you should be probing and questioning and debating and listening to what others are saying. It's why you should be in community groups so you can work out your salvation, because you say, I'm struggling with this thing. I want to believe, but I don't know how to believe. And somebody else can talk to you about why you can believe these things and why Jesus is trustworthy. But that intellectual exercise itself is not itself faith. The head knowledge of understanding these things is not itself faith. Faith is when you see these things and acknowledge these things and then begin to actually live differently because those things are true. And there's a riskiness in this because, like Abram being told to go to a foreign land, you don't know the destination, I'll tell you when you get there, is really what God says to him. And he moves. Now, I don't know how you are, but most of us, I'm certainly like this, I want to know end destination before I go. But God's saying, move. And he had good reason to move. He'd seen God work in all sorts of ways, but now he has to actually listen to that voice and follow God's voice, even though the destination seems uncertain and unclear. Even in the scriptures, one of the beautiful Psalms is Psalm 119. The whole book, longest book in the Bible, is all of it has got to do with the word of God. Delight yourself in the word of the Lord. And one of the great lines in it, the word of the Lord is a light for my path and a lamp for my feet. You know the passage well? And now this was not a 400 lumen mag light headlamp kind of thing. This is an oil lamp. It lights maybe 2 steps ahead. That's the best you get. Even if you know the scriptures and you study them as hard as you want, you may get 2 or 3 steps ahead lit for you. That's all you're going to get. And I think Jesus has designed it like that so you would take the step. I have no idea where I'm moving to, but you've given me enough to make a step in a direction, and I'm going to follow that voice, and I'm going to trust you because I've seen you at work in my life. I can see you at work in the lives of the early church. I can see you at work in the lives of all of these great saints of the faith who didn't know what the destination looked like, but chose to follow you, and you were faithful to them. And you will be faithful to me. Every one of these examples in Hebrews 11 are holy people who acted in accordance with their faith. It is never a head exercise. It is a way of living. Okay, so we've got a lot of armchair rugby players in the building, I would imagine. I do not know a great deal about rugby, but some of you know more about rugby than anybody else, right? Because you get very worked up about this. I've watched you, and you know all the details, and every play, you are better than the people on the field because you tell them how they should be playing, right? I mean, my dad used to do this all the time when I was a kid, and you get wound up because they shouldn't have kicked, they should have gone for the try, and you know, I know so little about this. Stephen Kitsoff was here this week, by the way, at our coffee shop. Michelle sent a post on the group with a photograph of her and him. I thought it was Ed Sheeran. I have no idea who Stephen Kitsoff is. So the thing is, you may think you know everything about the game, but you have never been on the field and played professional rugby. And Christian faith is being on the field playing the game, not standing on the stadium stands watching and telling people how to do it and having all the knowledge about how to do it. And I'm not disputing your knowledge, by the way, as rugby aficionados. But at some point you get on the field and you play the game. That's what faith is. So whilst the foundation of our faith is fact-based, Jesus broke into history and there is good evidence to believe that it happened. Faith itself is life lived on those truths. Are you tracking with me here? So you can believe something to be true, but you actually have to act in a different way because it's true. And that's what faith really is. So whilst the foundation is fact-based, the lived out reality is confidence and assurance about things that the evidence is pointing to. So intellectual Christianity says, Jesus died for my sins. That's really great. Saving faith says, I'm going to work as hard as I can to sin as little as I can because I dishonor the sacrifice that was made for me when I do sin and pretend that it's meaningless. That's what faith is. Intellectual Christianity says God can do the impossible, and you may even have a coffee mug on your desk that has a supporting verse for that statement. But saving faith says, I'll follow God when he asks me to do what seems impossible, just like Noah did when he obediently built the ark as God instructed, and he waited for the animals and the water to come. Faith is a lived life, not a mind game. Nominal Christianity says, I'll follow God if it makes sense to me and if I have all the evidence in a row. Saving faith says, I'm going to follow God even when it doesn't make sense and even when I don't know where the destination is, just like Abraham did when he left all that he knew to settle his family in that unknown land. Faith is following Jesus when the outcome is unclear. For we live by faith and not by sight. The Apostle Paul would write to the church in Corinth, and Hebrews 11:6 that we read just now says, without faith, listen to me very carefully. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. You may have all the information. You may know all the verses. Theoretical Christianity is not enough to save you. It's not enough to acknowledge that Jesus is true. Even the demons believe that and shudder. Saving faith is shaping your life around following Jesus, even when you have no idea how he's going to work things out, and the future may seem uncertain, and yet you still move in the direction he is calling you because you trust him, and you are building your life on some evidence that you've heard and evidence that you've seen and experienced yourself, but there's no evidence for the future, and so I'm going to move in faith in the direction that he is calling me to move. I watched a clip a couple of weeks back about a company in America. They make bulletproof vests. They're made out of a material called Kevlar, which is an incredibly strong material, but what makes it particularly good for bulletproof vests is it's quite stretchy. And so what happens is the bullet hits the vest and the material stretches and flexes, and instead of having a little 9mm bullet penetrating your chest and blowing your heart out, it spreads the load across the chest wall. And so they've got these engineers who sit there and work out different muzzle velocities of different kinds of weapons and how much impact force and energy there is, and then how much of this composite material to build into these vests. And in the video, the CEO of the company puts on a bulletproof vest and gets one of his staff to shoot him with a 9mm in the chest. And I'm like, wow, man. Now, the engineer is doing intellectual Christianity, right? He's working out all those math sums, densities of stuff, how fast these bullets are, how much they weigh, and if you work out how fast they're going and how much they weigh, you know how much inertia, and therefore this and that. And now faith is the CEO. He just goes, right, bring it on. That's what Christian faith is. Like, I have the evidence, I've done the maths, but at some point, I just begin to move, and I trust. Every one of these imperfect and flawed human characters heard God's call to a deeper obedience, and they listened. That's faith. And many of their stories in the Old Testament reveal their fear and their confusion and their uncertainty, but also their obedience. Every one of them at some point landed up at a crossroads in their lives where they had to make a fundamental decision of whether they would follow God or not. And in every one of those situations, they acted boldly with deep faith, trusting that God would deliver them, even when the future was really hazy and the information they had was thin. That is the essence of God-pleasing faith. And many hundreds of years after these greats of the faith had put their trust in what God would do in the future, a young Jewish rabbi performed the greatest act of faith that anyone has ever done. He believed and trusted that his sonship was secure and certain. In faith, Jesus trusted that the God of Abraham and Isaac would follow through with the sacrifice. In faith, he trusted that his sacrifice would be enough to save all of those who would put their faith in him. In faith, he believed that his death would make a way for all of God's lost children to come home. In faith, Jesus acted by willingly handing himself over to the Romans, trusting in faith that in the end God would do all he had promised, even if that path seemed uncertain and so very, very difficult. I remember years ago as a young Christian hearing a friend of mine who I came to faith under, a guy called Alan Spence, preached about this, and he asked the question, how did Jesus know Jesus was Jesus? Have you thought about this? And his answer was the same way you know you're a child of God. His experience was as human as yours and mine. He had to apprehend these things by faith. And in the greatest act of faith, he offered himself for us. and was revealed as the Son of God, the eternal begotten Son. That is faith. It's never agreeing in principle. It's living differently because of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. And then let me close with the last portion of this chapter, because I love this writing. I sense that the writer of this, he's talking about all these greats of the faith, and it's pretty cool. You've got Enoch and these guys, and then he just gets onto a roll. So I'm going to try and read it to you how I think he was telling it to the person that was writing it down for him, because he says, "What more shall I say? I don't have time to tell you about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again." But there were others who were tortured, who refused to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute. They were persecuted. They were mistreated. But the world was not worthy of them. They wandered in the deserts and in the mountains, and they lived in caves and in holes in the ground, and they were commended for their faith, and yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. These Old Testament people trusted God, and they looked forward to a day, and they haven't received it yet. They're waiting. They're waiting for you and me. That's what the scriptures teach us, that we will all be raised again in that day. Like Moses died an awfully long time ago, and he will wake up because he's outside of time. He will wake up at resurrection day, and I will wake up at resurrection day, and we will both look at each other and go, "No way, we're here." That's what faith is. Because Hebrews says we're longing for a country that is better than this one, and for a city whose foundations are built by the Lord. That's what we're longing for. We are strangers and aliens here. We don't belong here, but we're longing for that new Jerusalem. That's what faith is. And together with Moses and Enoch and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we will stand before the great Lord of the ages. Do you have faith? For if you do, you will get to see Jesus, and you will stand with the saints. You'll be made glorious through the Spirit's power, the Son's authority, and for the Father's joy. For without faith, it's just impossible to please God.